My name is Barbara Baikie, and I'll be one of the co-hosts for dinner for the evening tonight. So, welcome to 2021 Women's Climate Congress online conversation number 7, and this is Climate Science, Women and Kindness, and Connecting the Dots. First of all, I'd just like to do an acknowledgement of country to the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting tonight, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that the land that we're meeting on was never ceded. And you might like to pop in the chat the land on which you are on tonight as well. It's always lovely to see all those different locations. So we're coming together at 5:30, and I'm sure we've all been rushing around and very busy today. So we're just going to come together and just do a very brief breath in and out just to bring us here. So if you like to just sort of put your feet on the ground and put your hands in your lap and just take a deep breath. And if you feel comfortable closing your eyes or focusing, and just focusing on breathing in and breathing out. And breathing in stillness and breathing out, just letting go of all of that business, and just feel your body relaxing and being able to focus and pay attention to our wonderful speakers tonight. And now just coming back to this fabulous meeting. And just a bit of housekeeping. First of all, I think most of you got your screens on mute anyway. And also, if it is being recorded, so if you don't want it to be recorded, your face, just put your camera off. And also, as we go along, I mean, I know it's going to be very interesting and riveting, but if there are questions or comments you've got, please put them in the chat, because that adds to the richness of the conversation. And at the end, there'll be some time for Q&A, and I'll be selecting some of those questions to put to the panel. So tonight we're thrilled to be having not only Dr. Janet Salisbury, the founder of Women's Climate Congress, but two climate scientists, Associate Professor Melissa Hart and Dr. Angela Maharaj. And they're going to talk about those experiences as climate scientists. Sorry, something that I think is very exciting is the kindness in science movement. And also, Melissa's going to talk about her experience as a participant for the 2018 Homeward Bound Women in Science Leadership Residential Program in the Antarctica, which is amazing. So just a couple of quotes to set the scene. And the first one, a single act of kindness throws out roots in all directions. And the roots spring up and make new trees. And that quote's from Amelia Earhart. And the second one is, kindness in words creates confidence. Kindness in thinking creates profoundness. And kindness in giving creates love. And that's from Leo Tazet. So now I'm going to introduce Janet, and she'll share with us some threads of the conversations from the series so far, and then she'll formally introduce Melissa and Angela. So Dr. Janet Salisbury is a businesswoman, a science communicator, and formed the WCC, feels like a long time ago, but it was only January last year, 2020, to promote women's leadership for non-partisan action on climate change. So over to you, Janet.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and hello to everyone. It's nice to have so many of you on this conversation again this evening. Our topic today is climate science, women and kindness, connecting the dots. And this is the 7th of these online conversations that we have held this year. So it's easy to start to feel that they're all very interesting, but maybe a little bit disconnected. So before I introduce our two wonderful guests for today, I'm going to join a few dots from conversations that we've had so far this year. And we think this is important because we're getting closer to our first National Congress event, which is going to be held at the end of November, when we really are going to start to want to bring together the work that we've been doing over the past year and a half now. So I'm just going to share my screen here, this one. hopefully you can see there our vision statement. And just excuse me if I look slightly to the side while I go through this little bit because it's on my other screen. So our vision, we say, we share a vision to restore climate balance by 2030. In this future, women's leadership has helped turn the tide of political culture from polarised discord to collaboration and cooperation. Nurture of life and care for the earth are at the centre of every government decision. And if you go to our website, you can find our whole vision, values and commitment statement, which is on the About page. And if you haven't sort of been there and had a good look at that, I would really recommend that you do, to sort of see the full sweep of the values and the ideas that we're trying to bring to bear into this big conversation that we're having. So I'm just going to look at a couple of the points from our values and commitments statement in relation to the conversations that we've had so far this year. And then I hope you'll see how that also leads into the conversation that we're going to have here today. So two of our vision statements, or our values statements, I should say, are up on the screen now, and that they say that we're weary of conflict and polarisation, we resist judgment, and we embrace uncertainty and encourage mediation and collaboration so that we can go to a safe future in relation to climate change. And the second one is listening deeply to the science. We recognise the interconnections of Earth systems and human influences within those systems. With this in mind, we bring our collective imagination to uncover innovative, equitable and sustainable ways forward. And just to note that in our conversations this year, we've certainly been exploring these ideas in quite a few different ways. In March, April and May, we looked from different approaches to the ideas around collaboration and collaboration towards national action on climate change. In March, we welcomed Christina Teleko, who's the chair of an organisation, a centre-right organisation called Coalition for Conservation. And she was in conversation also with Dr. Kim Liu, who is from Doctors for the Environment. And they talked about collaboration, bringing different voices to the table, and how important that is in relation to climate change. And then in May, Rhianne Williams, who's a very, very experienced mediator who's worked in the political or the government policy making space in relation to trying to find paths through very polarised positions, talked about some ideas we have about a sort of a stakeholder process to bring people together across divides to work out a national plan. And so that's looking at a somewhat top-down approach, I suppose. But then in May, we had Millie Rooney and Julie Lyford, who have both been really engaged in the community in a really bottom-up community way. And this is where I think this uncovering in equitable and sustainable ways forward, really lots of ideas came to the fore and really bubbling up from the community. So we've been looking sort of a little bit of a top-down approach. What can we do at a government level to try and get people working together across the political divides, and then what's happening in the community and how can we tap into that. In June, so I'm just going to move down to the next here. One of our other statements here, we talk about the qualities of the heart, compassion, love, empathy. And these are, often people see these as, the weaker things, but to put those aside, true strength comes from being combative and so on. But we are saying that actually these qualities are the basis for true strength, and that we must reactivate these qualities now in these times that we're in. It's very important in order to move forward and find the way forward to safety in these times. And in June, we had Dr. Lynn Reader, who's the National Director of the Australian Compassion Council, and Reverend Sarah Bachelard, who leads a contemplative church here in Canberra, to talk about compassion. And they talked about how humans are sort of hardwired to have compassion, but we've tended to focus it inward towards our more direct families and close communities, and also in more somewhat short-term ways. But we can learn. It's like, you know, it's like strengthening a muscle. If we learn to look outwards and to broaden our beam of compassion, it can be, you know, that it can be a learned thing to nurture this sense and to extend it outwards more widely. And there has been research around that as well. And so we talked about that, and we talked about how some of these ideas could be sort of brought into our parliamentary system as well. So in July, we heard from two authors who have both, Jonica Newby and Rebecca Huntley, who have both written books about communicating about climate change, very much from the point of view of the emotions. And Rebecca Huntley, who's a social scientist, has looked at how, in order to communicate out with many other people in the community, we have to meet them sort of on an emotional level, or find an emotional connection in order to be able to communicate about climate change. And Jonica Newby talked a lot about the impact on within ourselves and how to manage that. And then in August, last month, we had a wonderful conversation. I'm going to move to the next slide, with First Nations woman, Dr. Mary Graham, and also Michelle Maloney, who's the founder of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, about how we can go back to some of the traditional wisdom of really connecting to the earth, the first law of the earth. And that was a very inspiring conversation. I think, can everyone please put their microphones on mute, because I'm getting some funny background noise happening. So going across all of these conversations, of course, there was a very strong theme of women rising and women's voices, and the importance of women's voices in all of these conversations. So today we're going to delve further into a couple of these themes. I'm still getting a lot of background noise. Is there some people not on mute out there? So we're going to delve further into these themes. Women will be at the centre. They're always one of our themes, obviously. And we're going to be thinking about the lens that women bring to the way in which major disciplines are framed, I suppose. And in this case, we're looking at science, which, like politics, economics, and other disciplines, has been very much framed in the past through a male lens, historically, and women have been fitting in as best they can. And we're also remembering that we remember that women can also be an indicator of other diversity, because when women are missing from the table, there's lots of others missing as well. And so that overall diversity is very much reduced. And we will also ask if bringing forward some of these issues of the heart, including compassion, kindness, and love, could actually change the relationship between scientists, the broader community, and policy. So I hope that gives a little bit of an overview of some of the ideas that we've been thinking about and how they might be gradually coming together to help us think really about how we can make the changes that we need to make, how women's voices and these ideas that we've been exploring can be used to really impact our systems, our political systems, I suppose, to make the changes that we need to make. So now to our two guests. You've all seen their bios in the invitations that we've sent out, and they've been on our website, so I'm not going to go through in great detail. But it's a great pleasure to welcome Associate Professor Melissa Hart. Maybe she can just give a little wave so you know which one that is. And she's the Graduate Director of the ARC Centre for Excellence for Climate Science. And she's been working on a programme for some years, sort of looking holistically at PhD programmes in cross-institutional terms. And she has research interests that are based around the impact of climate on cities and of cities on climate. And she's also been a strong advocate of gender equity. And as we'll hear later, she's one of the lucky women who has actually been part of the Homeward Bound programme, which is a leadership programme for women in science, technology, engineering, and maths and medicine, STEM as we call it. So we're going to hear a little bit more about that later. So welcome, Melissa. And our other guest is Dr. Angela Maharaj. She holds academic positions at the University of New South Wales, although I gather that just at the moment she's on a Office of the Chief Scientist Scholarship Programme and doing some work in the Australian Public Service, sort of finding out how policy is made, so it's getting a different perspective on things. So Angela is actually the president of the Australian Meteorological and Oceanographic Society, which is the peak national body for climate scientists, scientists working in weather and in allied fields. She's actually the first, I think I'm right in saying, she's the first woman to be the president of that society, and also she's the first woman of colour to be the president of that society. So this seems an excellent fit for Angela's interest, because she's got research interests in oceanography and meteorology, but she's also very got interest and expertise in education and science education. And she's been very passionate about science literacy and lifelong learning. So she's been engaged with a number of projects linking schools to university. So I think that's, so welcome, Angela. So you could probably both put yourselves off mute now, and I'm going to start to talk to you. So I'm going to start by asking you both to say a little bit about what it's like to be working in the front line of climate science, because you're very close to the reality, the data of the science on a daily basis. So I wonder what it's been like for you over the past years, watching the clock ticking and opportunities for decisive action slip away. And I say that with thinking about the latest Ipcc report, which is probably on most people's minds at the moment, where we've had a code red warning. However, I just might say we're not today going to be talking about the science in great detail. We're sort of looking at more the context of how science happens. Anyway, I invite you to respond, both of you, to those thoughts. Who would like to go first?
Don't mind.
Oh, Angela.
I was just going to say, Janet, that just a slight correction, I'm the second female president.
Right.
So I increased the number of women by 100% when I took on the role. I am the first person of colour, though, to take on the presidency. Yeah. I guess I'll answer very quickly, and then we'll let Melissa have a go. Yeah, so I guess, people have probably seen some of the media, or have gone off and had a look at some of the key messages from the Ipcc report, and it's fairly grim reading. We're not going to go into all the details, like you said, but we're looking at global surface temperatures of 1.1 degrees Celsius higher than the 1850 to 1900, which we use as the benchmark. That's globally. In Australia, warming has exceeded 1.4 degrees Celsius. And remembering that the Paris Agreement, we're trying to curb our global temperature anomalies to 1.5 degrees. It is quite alarming, I guess. It can feel very alarming, and I think for people who work in climate science, it's often very surreal, but then because you see it so much in your work, you're looking at the graphs all the time, you're talking about it, you're writing about it, it can also be quite normalized. And I guess that's part of just, it's human nature to kind of try to find a way to function. Like, you can't have a very elevated stress level about things all the time, right? So you learn to compartmentalize. So I think often the focus is more on sort of, personal career goals, like, you're in a job like everybody else, and so you're working on that. And so you think about that most of the time. So the trick, I think, is often to get the balance right between being functional without being too self-involved and forgetting that this is really an important issue, but also being meaningful without giving up too much of your sanity and your well-being and things that you value, because otherwise you would just be, I don't know, working on this day and night, I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah, shall I go? It's been interesting to see the response to the Ipcc report. So as scientists, as climate scientists, for us, it was not a shock at all. It was what we were expecting, but interesting to see the public response, the media's response, which is this one of horror and of shock. And in some ways, a little bit of a feeling that I had from it all was, I'll admit, some frustration, where it's like, yeah, that's what climate science have been saying. This is what what people have been saying for a very long time. So this, and understanding the shock if people were not ready for it, but thinking, why was that level of shock when this is something we knew was happening and which has been reported? And it does make me reflect on, maybe it's not being talked about enough, maybe it needs to be more visible in the general public, this I guess this new world that we've created, that we are now living in. So that's been interesting for me. Similar to Angela though, I find everyday life, as Janet mentioned, I work on cities and urban climate, and in cities you've kind of got what I call a double whammy effect, where, you know, we're living in a warmer world because of climate change, but also cities are warmer as well than surrounding areas because of urbanization. So for the majority of us that do live in cities, it's that initial, sort of additional impact as well to make sort of more of these more uncomfortable climates. And so you see this, you see the numbers, you plot the graphs and such, and you think, gee, that's really high, that's shocking and such. But then it is your job, it's numbers, you produce the papers you write and such, and you talk to people about it. But what really takes me by surprise and makes me gasp is then when we experience these extreme events, and they're the ones where I go, oof, that really hit me here. So whether it be the Black Summer fires or the heat events that we've had, or you see some of the flooding events around the world and such. And so even as a climate scientist, even though I know that we're expecting them and they're going to happen, when they do occur, they still really hit me. And it's like, wow, look at what we're doing. And this is just going to get worse unless we drastically change our actions.
Thanks, Melissa. Yes, we need some big changes somewhere in the system, but the big systems changes, I think. Angela, a while ago, I asked you to review something that the Congress had written about climate balance. And in that paper, I had referred to the scientists as having worked tirelessly to show us the data and help us understand how the Earth system will respond. Because I am very admiring of climate scientists, and I want to, I desperately want community to support them and to listen to them. And you responded to me that, and this is quote what you said, this is a very rose-tinted view of a hyper-competitive and cutthroat system that doesn't always work to the benefit of society or the scientists in the system, especially women. And you also introduced me to the idea of the kindness in science movement, which I then went away and have looked up. So could you tell us a little bit about this? Why do we need a kindness in science movement?
Thanks, Janet. Yes, so I guess where that perhaps slightly visceral response came from for me when I was going through that document was, there's often this sort of picture, we have these very stereotypical pictures of things, right? Scientists, in the media, they'll say scientists are saying this or doing this, and then there's this sort of picture of people in white lab coats. And I think there's a very similar picture around a lot of research science, especially around climate science as well, is that it's extremely collaborative. Now, it is collaborative. It's not to say that it isn't, but it is a very very rose-tinted view of how the reality of that sector is. And I guess where that comes from is this hyper competition. And where that hyper competition comes from is if you examine the participants in that sector. So if you look at people who are working in higher learning sort of institutions and in research institutions, and we think about universities in particular. So what we have to think about is just how it's set up, right? So just one exercise that people can do, for example, is think about how many people might be doing a PhD in Australia. It's something like, I think 10,000 or so people graduate with a PhD in Australia per year, right? Every year. How many of those do you think PhD graduates are probably aspirations to stay in research, right? How many of those do you think would get to a professor level? So you can pop it in the chat box if you want to have a go at it, or you can just think about it in your mind. in percentage terms? Like, do you think maybe it'll be 20%, 50%? Someone has said 5%, right? So on average, how many people you think might be getting to a professor level? Well, the numbers that we've been told are 0.045%. All right, so that number actually comes from the UK. It's a Royal Society report, but the Australian Office of the Chief Scientist also quotes that as being comparable for Australia. So that 0.045% of PhD graduates will become professors. That's 1 in 222 PhDs, right? Only 3.5% become permanent staff in academia. So you could imagine how many of those would be diverse, right? Would be Indigenous, of color, or diverse abilities, or female, or first in family. Pretty small number of people. So what we're looking at is this sector, which has this sort of a very fat pyramid, right? Really big base at the bottom and a really small tip at the top. But then if you go on a website at some point, go to a university website, your favorite university, your favorite department, perhaps one you've attended, perhaps one your kids or your grandkids are going to, or they're interested in, and have a look at the makeup of the people who are within that department. And often you will find that it's actually lots and lots of people who are professors and associate professors, and often very few lecturers or senior lecturers. So when you look within the sector, like, for those people who actually have perhaps longer term contracts or have tenured positions, it's actually an inverted pyramid, right? So you have the people at the lower levels, so very few of, and there's loads and loads of people who are sitting at professor and associate professor levels. And that's because of the way the university system is set up. There are promotions, right? A to E level promotions, tenured positions can be hard to get, but once people get them, in Australia, mobility in academia is really low. So you've got this big pyramid for the entire sector with lots of people at the bottom who have been brought into this culture and being told, PhD is what you got to do. Research is what you want to do with your life. Like, this is your calling. Any other job is not good enough. It's like a pyramid scheme, I guess, in a way. And then you have a few people who are very privileged at the top. They've earned their way there, no doubt about it. At least most of them would have earned their way there. But it's kind of like they become the gatekeepers, right? And then because there's so many people trying to get into those roles, you get a huge amount of competition. The universities also have to pay out these salaries and try to keep these people on. And so the goalposts keep moving. So every generation of PhDs that are coming through and trying to create a career in research, the goalposts for them have changed. They have to achieve way more to get to the same level that people did in the previous generation. So that's what I call that they call it the merit system. I call it the academic Hunger Games. Like, honestly, it's how it feels when you're in it. So that's really quite different to, this sort of idea that, everybody's working collaboratively, because actually the way the system works is for you to be able to maintain a career, you need to compare yourself to others and show that you're doing better. Right? They literally ask you for that in order to, say, go for a promotion or to go for a job. So I think that's where you get the values, or you get the behaviors that I guess would be unkind, right? So it's constant comparison to people, very metrics driven, which means that you're constantly reducing people's contribution to the community to a number, and valuing certain things but not valuing other things. So you often value things that you can measure easily. So that would be, like papers published, citation of the papers, etc. And not so much value the things that might be hard to measure, like how well you collaborate, perhaps, or how much you've provided input to a team. So teamwork, for example, is something that's really hard. Other than authorship on papers, it can be really hard to show. It's not something that's necessarily rewarded, whereas individuals are encouraged to show how they're doing, like really well and doing better than other people. So it basically values individuals over teams, and it values individual promotion, and self-promotion over collaborative teamwork, and acknowledging that it takes lots of people to do something that's very challenging. So I think that's where, to me anyway, I think that's where the maybe lack of kindness comes from. So you know, that seems to be where the issue is. And so there was this initiative that started in New Zealand, and they were, I think it came from this idea that, you know, actually, if you were to think about it, collaboration and kindness is not only going to make a better workplace for people in science, it's actually going to give us better science outcomes, right? Because when we think about it, you know, it's going to be about not just about inclusion for the sake of inclusion, and it's not about being kind for the sake of being kind, but if you have, if you're kinder to people in the sense that you allow them to have a voice, you have more ideas that get viewed, you have more skills that are contributing to certain tasks. And if you can share, I guess, you know, like you share the credit, you share the workload, you share the salary, you will in fact find that you get better outcomes for science, which is the same reason that we encourage diversity. It's not just because we think it's a really good idea and it's ethical, it's because we know that that leads to better outcomes.
Thank you. So Melissa, I know that you have been quite engaged with this movement, taking it forward in Australia, because Angela mentioned that it did start in New Zealand. I read this definition of kindness in science, which says, kindness in science is an inclusive approach that fosters diversity, respect, well-being and openness, leading to better science outcomes, which is similar to what Angela was just saying. So can you talk us through about how this works, or how you've been working with this?
So the Kindness in Science initiative really resonated for me, because as mentioned at the beginning, I lead a graduate program, and Angela's just talked about the issues around academia and the path if you wanted to do a PhD and go into academia as well. So the program I lead, we have close to 100 PhD students across 5 universities, all lovely climate scientists, so really important people, really important knowledge base working at any one time. And so it's important for me to, the program that I lead, it's important for me for these graduates to come out with sort of breadth and depth of knowledge and to be ready for jobs in multiple sectors, which they do go on to, which is fabulous. But I also reflect on the fact that the PhD can be an incredibly competitive, incredibly challenging time. And so, and often PhD students do need to work with colleagues that sometimes are not so kind to them. It's a really competitive field. You get a lot of continuous feedback. So through peer review of your science and such, which can, or grant applications and such, which can sort of, I don't know, be quite disconcerting, because you do come across just a lot of times when you're not successful. So it's really difficult. So when I first heard about this initiative, it really did resonate with me, because I believe that I'm a very kind person. I'm a very empathetic person. I have been called too huggy. Yep, that one stuck with me. I've been told that my program is fluffy. Yeah, anyhow. And so I thought, okay, let's roll this out across the centre that I work in, which is, you know, the key climate scientists within Australia. And what was wonderful is the Australian Academy of Science Early to Mid-Career Researcher Forum had run a Kindness in Science workshop, and they pulled together resources. It's available on their website, where they've got PowerPoint slides and a full run sheet where you can take their resources and run your own Kindness in Science workshop, and it is wonderful. So I took it to our centre's annual workshop with a colleague of mine, and we ran this workshop. The workshop's really great. It includes things like a values exercise where you identify values important to you and then discuss how they related to kindness in science. You share experiences of when you've experienced kindness in science, or when you may not have, and you talk about the challenges that may come with kindness, but also the opportunities, and try and make plans going forward to create this kinder, more inclusive environment within your centre. So we did that. I thought it was incredibly successful. However, I will say that workshop, the majority of people, it ran in parallel with a couple of other workshops, and the majority of people that came to the workshop were the so-called kind people, and the people that you think, you kind of need this workshop, went to the science communications workshop or something else. So the next year, I rolled it out again, but at our workshop dinner, where everybody was stuck and they couldn't escape from it, but a much smaller component. And I did have some feedback with people going, what is she making us do this? Why are we talking about values at dinner and kindness? But a lot of other people could really see the importance of having these conversations. And it's something that I think should be an ongoing conversation, and with the hope that with time we will have systematic change. So that the initiative is like, rather than having just the winner takes all type of thing, but instead have a more collaborative, engaged sort of society within science. And as Angela mentioned again, you know, you're going to get better results as well if you include more people and are more collaborative, rather than just having the key sort of like one top prof or something, just taking it all and running with it, and everybody else running behind trying to catch up. So definitely recommend running kindness in science workshops in any of your workplaces, organisations, and having these conversations.
So I just want to quickly ask you both, not without taking too much time, because I want to have a little bit of time left for looking at the Homeward Bound program as well in a minute. And if any, by the way, if people have got any questions, put them in the chat and we'll make a bit of space at the end for Q&A. So I just want to, so with this kindness in science, I mean, how could you see that impacting the way in which science sort of relates to the community? I mean, because I'm thinking about the Ipcc now, which is, you know, which looking in from the outside seems like a collaborative sort of venture, but could this sort of kindness in science approach change the way in which that program, the Ipcc, interacts with the world? It always seems like the science is a little bit over on one side and a bit of a disengaged between that and the, well, it's very frustrating that this is the case, between that and the policy. So would this kindness in science movement, this collaborative approach, be able to bring the community together more, do you think, or what sort of impact could it have in that way?
Yeah, I suppose. You know, so I mean, the Ipcc claims to have consensus. It doesn't claim to have kindness. But you know, I mean, I think the Ipcc is actually a fairly collaborative endeavor. But the Ipcc doesn't encompass everybody in the community or in the climate science community. And certainly not to the same level of participation, right? So people have different levels of participation. And you know, I think the Ipccs have actually done some really lovely things. And there's definitely a push, I think, towards acknowledging that we need, not just acknowledging, but actually taking action on having more diversity and sharing credit. And I think those are two good things. And there's probably more. I mean, you know, people tend to do some really nice things. So I think, you know, I know I may have painted a rather stark picture with my Hunger Games analogy, but you know, there's, I think, a lot of truth in it, and it's a great set of books and a great movie, a great set of movies. So good analogy. I think there's a few things that we can do better in general in our climate community. And I think one of it is to encourage, recognize, and celebrate teamwork. The Ipcc at least works as a team, so I think they already do that, which is fantastic. I think when you have a platform to speak for someone else, is a really important thing to do. And that's one way of not making everything about sort of yourself or your team or your group. So, you know, when you have a platform, it's a good opportunity to thank others who've helped to make things happen, or to note the challenges being faced by others, like the type of discussion we're having here. And I think an important one, which I don't know how well we're doing in our community or in any research community, is not to outstay your welcome in leadership roles. And I think that's a really big part of it, because often the leaders are setting the culture, right? And you have generations of people coming through. Often the young people have no idea how things are done, and they have much broader, kinder, inclusive ideas, you know, like they're quite happy to take their PhD and go work in government or in industry, or to include, you know, like a larger set of voices into a discussion about science, or how to, you know, advocate for certain things. It's actually the leadership where the culture comes from, where it's like, oh, no, we're better than those people, you know, this university is better than that university, oh, you don't want to go work there, you know, which is the kind of thing that you know, creates so much stress in young people's lives who are trying to just find a way to have a career, you know, have a meaningful life and being able to pay a mortgage and do something they enjoy. So I actually think we need leaders to think about the fact that it's not about them, it's about the community, and it's about the institutional values. And a really good way to do that is to do your job for a little bit and then move out and make space for other people to come through, especially people from younger generations. And to be honest, I don't know how well the IPCC does that. I would say broadly in our science, we're not good at that. And that's where maybe just climate advocacy as well is something we can think about. So I think in the chat, somebody asked, how can we do, like, take urgent action more kindly? And one of the ways is to give more people a voice. And that's really happening now. And I think that's what's making the difference. You know, the people who are asking for action on climate is not just the scientists. It's, you know, it's mums and grandmothers and teachers and sports people and everybody else. And that's really important, I think, in general, for people to feel like this is a really important issue that impacts everyone's lives, and not just a relatively elite or sort of removed from society bunch of people. At least that's often the perception of scientists, that are, you know, banging on about stuff that, you know, maybe matters, maybe doesn't matter.
Thanks. I'm going to use that as a segue, Melissa, into showing this little video that I've got, and then you can talk and follow up on any loose ends in relation to that. Melissa, as I mentioned at the beginning, Melissa is an alumnus, or she has been part of a program called Homeward Bound, which is a Women in Science leadership program. And it involves a group of 100 women each year going on an intensive, I suppose, residential intensive on a boat on a ship to Antarctica. And while they're on the ship, they have intensive leadership. And I'm just going to show you a little video.
There are many things that concern people nowadays about what is happening to the planet. At some level, whether it's climate crisis or poverty, education or gender, biodiversity loss or the warming of our oceans, somewhere along the line we have to say, what kind of leadership got us to where we are today? And if we can understand that, ask ourselves, what kind of leadership will move us into tomorrow? Mother Nature really does need her daughters. More of us standing up to be collaborative, inclusive, legacy-minded. Homeward Bound was founded to create a global network of women with a STEM background willing and able to lead and solve our planet's greatest challenges. Right now, we're incredibly proud to welcome our 6th cohort, joining a global collaboration of 500 women strong, all chosen because they have the credentials and, most importantly, the will to work together to a more inclusive, legacy-minded world. The global COVID pandemic has given all of us pause to rethink what leadership at its best looks like. People have risen up, men and women, recognising the urgency of the crisis, working together, listening carefully to the people and how to enable swift agile responses. These things will stand beside us as we move forward into what may be one of the hardest decades of the human experience.
So, Melissa, would you like to tell us a little bit about this program that you were part of, and maybe I wanted to sort of ask a little bit from the previous conversation about kindness in science, about, you know, are there more women involved, and did this leadership program also sort of reinforce some of those same ideas?
It did, actually. As I was watching the video then, I was thinking Homeward Bound's a really nice example of kindness in science. It's a collaborative approach to leadership. It's always a very kind environment. We did similar values-driven sort of exercises and such, so it is a really nice example. I came about the Homeward Bound program because I was in a situation where I had a leadership role in the centre that I work within, and at the time a number of women in similar positions in the leadership was very, very, very small. So I would have the situation where I'd be very often the only woman in a room of 15, 16 very loud men in a meeting, and I'd be kind of like, but you know, and being talked over and such. I guess, yeah, so I was looking for leadership training. I was looking for guidance. I'm somebody who responds really well to professional development. I like to do sort of lifelong professional development to remind myself. So I came across this program and it ticked all of the boxes for me. I was like, what is this amazing thing? It's Women in STEM. It was leadership training. It was a year-long program, and then it culminated in this trip to the most extraordinary place in the world, in Antarctica. So it's an amazing program. As the video says, we're up over 500 women now. The idea is 1,000 women to be trained with the skills in order to lead into a sort of a future, more sustainable Earth. Women come into the program, and in a normal time, sort of without COVID making things tricky, you do development training throughout the year. So it's lots of Zooms in large groups, smaller groups, and then so training around leadership and strategy, communication, visibility, like all of these really fabulous skill sets. And then it culminates in a 3-week voyage to Antarctica, where you come together and you continue that development process. The program came about via the founder, Fabian Datner, who you could hear speaking on that video there, who runs a leadership training company. She was doing leadership training for the Australian Antarctic Division with women down in Hobart, and was talking to them one day about the issues that they had in Antarctica as women scientists working in Antarctica, and then the realization that it was only in recent decades that women were even allowed to go and work in Antarctica. And so she had this literal dream where it was like, well, I'll show you what I will take this large group of extraordinary women to Antarctica. So this amazing vision that actually has come from ground up like work, and now we're up to advertising for the 7th cohort now. So really quite extraordinary. One of the things that the program also talks about is this network of eventually 1,000 women. And this was one of the things I actually underestimated, the importance of this network. I went in there thinking mainly of the development opportunities, and came out of it with the strengths of all of these women behind me. So the women that were on my ship, but also the women that came before me, and the women that are going after. So even though it's a year-long program you go into, I'm still involved with Homeward Bound. They still offer development sessions for us. We still run events. Anytime I had the opportunity to travel, I would meet up with Homeward Bounders. I have a saying that there's a Homeward Bounder for any occasion. So I've reached out to my Homeward Bound sisters for feedback on promotion applications, to go and see Harry Potter and the Cursed Child with me, or for help when my cat needed to go to the vet, like anything.
Yes.
So I just think that network.
It sounds like a really wonderful program for the women that have taken part in it. I think it has become very multicultural as well. We were talking about that the other day when it started in Australia, I think, and now it's very international. And so as always on these occasions, the time is a little bit, I guess there's so many different little threads that we can unpick there. And I mean, I'd get a huge buzz when I hear, I'm on some sort of notification thing and I hear what some of the women that have been on that program have been doing, and you suddenly find they've been elected into some political position, or they've published a book, or, you know, like there does seem to be a lot of good stuff that's sort of coming out of that. But I just want to hand briefly to Barb Baikie to see if she's noticed anything coming in the chat, in the Q&A, that we can follow up. We might just have to spill over by a couple of minutes today. I'm sorry I've let this conversation go on a little bit longer than we normally try and keep fairly tight to the time, but maybe we can snatch an extra 5 minutes. So I'll just hand over to Barb Baikie to see what's coming up.
Okay, thank you, Janet, and thank you, Melissa and Angela, for very stimulating conversations and discussions. And also, too, I just want to acknowledge and say thank you to Joanne Eade for dropping all those wonderful links in. So I hope you've been checking those out, and well, not right now, but taking time to have a look at them later, because there's some great links there. There's a question from Marina, and this is asking about kindness in science. Does it only relate to kindness in humans, or does it extend to kindness to non-human animals, e.g. animal testing, animal agriculture, which also directly affects climate change? So I guess either Angela or Melissa, whichever wants to take a lead on that.
An easy response. I would think that like to think that it also should relate to just kindness to our environment as well. So it doesn't need to be just, you know, human to human kindness, but you know, we're here to talk about what we're currently doing to our climate system. So yeah, I think it should resonate throughout our entire ecosystem.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think, you know, if you work in environmental science and climate science, you know, sort of is part of that. It's also maths and physics, but it's a lot of environmental science. It's hard not to think about things like biodiversity and sustainability as being really important principles. And I think if you think about kindness in science in the context of our work, those sorts of principles are really important. So yeah, I would agree.
Fantastic, and thank you. And we've got another question from Sarah Lukeman, and she says, you would never run a business the way research is run in Australia. People wasting so much time writing grants to pay for themselves and less than 10% success rate. It's appalling the way to treat our best and brightest. Can kindness in science movement help to change the system, and is there another way?
I think we need... we touched on this in earlier discussions, kindness in politics, and so yes. And kindness in leadership, and kindness in the way that our universities are funded, the way that our research is funded. And I agree completely, it's absolutely ridiculous the amount of time lost for people writing proposals that are not going to get funded when they could be doing amazing science that could have so much benefit to society. Absolutely absurd, absolutely absurd. So yeah.
I'm actually going to disagree with that, and that I think the problem is that we're not thinking about this with a long enough lens and where the actual problems are. So first thing I'd say is, I think if you think about academia, research-focused academics gaslight teaching academics all the time and make them feel like they're second-class citizens, right? Combined track academics are told, focus on your research and, you know, like just get through the teaching as quickly as you can. And that's where the income for the university is actually coming from, right? What keeps universities afloat are students. and teaching, and we are paid with taxpayer dollars. So I think where we constantly talk about how to keep research going and let's get more funding, we are refusing to acknowledge the fact that that university environment, research agencies are different, of course, that university environment is meant to be about research and higher learning. And the idea of having both there is that the research should inform the higher learning so that when those students are coming out at the end of their degrees, whether it's undergraduate or postgraduate, they're coming out at the forefront of that area of expertise, right? That's the whole point of putting those two things together, and to give research some independence from government, etc., right? And so the way to get that is, first of all, to acknowledge where the money is coming from and acknowledge the fact that we need to be doing both well and give credit where it's due, that it's people who teach who are keeping the university afloat. Now, most people who get to professor and associate professor, I get there from doing research. And there is often this culture of, avoid the teaching, avoid the teaching, avoid the teaching, which is awful, right? You need to be doing both. But I think the real problems are that we have these tenured positions and we have these A to E promotions, and it's keeping people who get to those roles there and not moving out. Right. What we need is more interaction between government and industry and NGOs and universities, so people are moving in and out of these jobs. So we need to get rid of tenured positions. I reckon 10-year rather than tenured. That's my.
That sounds great. Now there's two other questions slash comments that I'm actually going to combine it from. Kirsten was saying that Antarctica is one of the most fragile places on Earth. And do you think that Homeward Bound program is sufficiently justification to enter this special landscape? But then also too, we've got Kate Mcmaster, who was on the very first Homeward Bound, and she was in the first cohort in 2016, and currently recruiting for HB7, which Melissa mentioned. And so if you'd like to give sort of some comment on that, particularly Melissa, so you've been involved in the program.
Super good point. I've just noticed that Kate has said that the Homeward Bound is extending the goal to 10,000 women globally, which is wonderful. But the Antarctica part of the program, most definitely, it's always a discussion, and it's always a challenge, because of course it's one of the most fragile parts of the globe. It's one of the most fragile parts of the climate system. So should we really be going there? And that's one I struggled with. The program sort of justifies that it brings visibility to Antarctica, to the issues that are taking place in Antarctica with respect to climate change. It brings visibility to the fact that we have women scientists in Antarctica. And as I mentioned, it's only been in recent decades that women have even been allowed to work in Antarctica, and women who have worked in Antarctica recently, there's been a lot of instances of bullying and just really uncomfortable situations for them. So it does bring visibility to this safe sort of space for women in Antarctica, the fact that we belong where we should be there. If men's scientists should be there, then women's scientists should be there as well. But definitely agree that it's a balance. We do offset emissions from the voyages, though I do know that that's not always, it's not going to make 100% of the difference. It does make an issue. And there's been ongoing conversations about how the program can continue as well, but without the Antarctica component, which has been happening during COVID, though there is plans for some more Antarctic voyages, but definitely a key discussion and ongoing discussions around whether we should be going to Antarctica.
Thanks very much. And just sort of follow on from that too, there's a comment from Telia King, and I think this is great too. She's talking about how loved the program since she did an interview for it, but also about the questioning and the importance of questioning everything, and that, whatever we're doing, questioning it and also making a point of offsetting it. And I think that's also the point about kindness, that, everybody in their everyday life should be thinking about, how we can be kind and generous. And there's quite a few comments also about, and from Barbara O'Dwyer, kindness in everything, in politics, business, the public service, etc., etc. From Pippa, a comment about the arts have the same structures and problems, and I think it's in many industries, not only science, that we could all benefit from a lot more kindness. And from Judy, I guess that kindness is king in every aspect of life. So I think that's, you know, we need to think about it as individuals, but also structurally as well, because there's a lot of not kindness out there right now. So, okay. There's a few more questions.
Maybe one more quick one, and then we can, yeah.
Okay. I guess there's one about, you know, offsetting from Kate Mcmaster, also about carbon offsetting, and also relating that there's ethical and moral questions to come together too. So look, I think there's quite a few comments there, but I think that's probably, you know, overall, I think we've probably picked up most of the questions. So thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Barb. And that's been a very stimulating conversation. Thank you very much to Melissa and to Angela. Maybe we can just give them a little sort of round of applause. It's really interesting that it's coming up in the chat about kindness in everything. Yeah, we certainly do in the Women's Climate Congress think a lot about kindness in politics, or bringing compassion in, and that as a way of stopping the, you know, very argy-bargy adversarial environment that there is there, which must be absolutely awful, I always think, as a workplace. I mean, we know it's, we've heard a bit of being awful for women in this year particularly, but it must be fairly awful for everyone, I think. And interestingly, Hugh Mackay, an Australian social researcher who's written many books, his most recent book is actually called The Kindness Pandemic. So I haven't actually read it yet, but it's clearly an idea that time has come. So just to finish off, I'm going to share my screen and just show you what's coming up, as I normally do. So our next conversation, one of these Tuesday conversations, will be on the 12th of October. I think it's going to be 12 to 1, but just watch the space to be confirmed. And we're going to have Dr. Emma Dawson, who's the executive director of an organisation called Per Capita, but she quite often appears on the drum talking about social change, sort of the changes that we need to get to a more sustainable and equitable society. And she's actually the co-editor of a book which is called What Happens Next? Reconstructing Australia After COVID, which is a series of essays, very interesting essays, which relate to some of the changes that we have been talking about. And just to note also, while we're here, that the Women's Climate Congress has a Zoom book club, which is for members only, so you need to go to our website and join via the Join Us form on the homepage. And the next book club is also going to talk about this book, which and that's on Monday the 11th of October. It's a little bit close together, those two things. But if you go to our website, which is the address here, and go to the events page, you can find out about those events. And just to give another plug, coming up at the end of November is our one-day online event, which is the first in a series of events which are now replacing what we were previously hoping was going to be a 3-day face-to-face conference, the National Congress of Women, and that we were going to hold at the end of November in Canberra, but we've now called that off because of the COVID restrictions. And this event on the 30th of November is the first, it's a sort of a launch for a series of events which will hopefully come together in a face-to-face meeting next year. So thank you. I'll just go out. Thank you again, everyone, for participating today, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.